So the trial was extraordinarily dramatic. Tell me about the moments in the trial that established that crucial proposition that denying marriage to gays and lesbians would not help anyone and would obviously hurt them. There was a very dramatic moment on the stand with David Blankenhorn, who had been a fierce opponent of gay marriage, and after your cross-examination actually changed his mind. Tell us about that.
Yes, David Blankenhorn was probably the country's leading opponent of marriage equality. And he had an institute, he had written books, he gave lectures, and he was their lead expert at trial. They'd had a number of other experts that they had listed. We'd taken their depositions. They hadn't held up very well from their standpoint, and they dropped them. But Blankenhorn was their key witness and a serious witness, a serious scholar, a serious writer, a serious author. And on cross-examination, I set out to try to establish the two factual principles we wanted to do. And I began by taking him through all of the benefits of marriage, how it gives a couple greater security, a greater sense of recognition, a greater tie to the community, a greater sense of commitment. And then at the end of that, I said, isn't that going to be true for gay and lesbian couples as well as heterosexual couples? And he really had no answer to that, and he had to agree. And I then asked him, what were all the benefits of marriage to the children that were being raised by married couples? You know, why was being married, why is being part of a married household better for children than being raised by single parents? And he again explained in some detail all the benefits that came to children from having their parents married. And I said, well, that must be true for gay and lesbian, the children of gay and lesbian couples as well. And he agreed with that. And so we had established the first principle, which is that depriving gay and lesbian citizens of the right to marry seriously harmed them and harmed their children. I then turned to the other one, the other question, which is who benefits? And that was a lot harder. There was a lot of back and forth on that. But in the final analysis, he agreed and conceded that he didn't have any evidence that there was any harm that came to anybody from allowing gay and lesbians to marry. And if you think about it, I mean, that's so obviously true that it probably should not have taken me as long as it did to establish it in the cross-examination. In the beginning of the case, when I would sometimes speak to largely heterosexual audiences, and many of which were in the beginning somewhat hostile to this litigation, you know, I would ask them, I'd say, if you're married, would you raise your hand? People would raise their hand. And I would say, now, those of you who are going to get divorced if gays and lesbians are able to marry, put your hand down. And then I would say, now, what I'd like to know is which of you out there who are married, I'd like you to raise your hand if, when you were thinking about getting married, you would have decided not to marry your husband or wife if your gay or lesbian neighbor down the street was able to get married. And nobody raised their hand. And the fact is obvious. People don't get married because somebody else is or is not going to get married. The truth of that was pretty obvious to me, and eventually to David Blankenhorn. And about 18 months, 2 years after the trial, Mr. Blankenhorn wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in which he recanted. And he said he recognized he'd been wrong and that his position was hurting a lot of people without any need and without any benefit.